Hello, everyone.
Hi,
This is Miss Megan Martin.
and Mrs. Ashley Moyer. Today, we will be discussing comprehension strategies that assist with summarization.
During this presentation, we are going to describe two different strategies that will assist students with identifying key parts of a story.
Both of the strategies that you will hear about will allow students to order the events in which they happen and assist students in retelling the story.
Mrs. Moyer and I chose these two specific comprehension strategies because we noticed at both of our schools that there was a lack in our students' comprehension skills, specifically their inability to summarize.
That's right, and these two techniques that we have selected to showcase can be easily modified for any grade or ability level.
We will begin our presentation by introducing the two different strategies.
Next, we will read Three Billy Goats Gruff, written by Maria Alperin and illustrated by Kate Pankhurst.
Following the story, I will begin with the plot relationship chart. I will start with a model that we will fill out together. Next, I will show student examples and finish with a time for hands-on for you to practice this technique.
After Miss Martin presents on the plot relationship chart, I will follow with the story circle strategy. I will follow the same outline as Miss Martin with a model, student examples, and finish with time for you to try.
We will conclude this webinar by providing different variations of how these strategies can be differentiated.
Enjoy!
We would like to provide our viewers with some background and supporting information about the two different strategies or concept maps that we have selected. These strategies both lead to summarization. Summarization is one of the categories for comprehension recognized by the National Reading Panel. Concept maps are a great way to organize your thoughts. In one study done by Ernest, fifth graders' ability to summarize was enhanced when they were assisted in the construction of concept maps until they were able to construct a map independently. The group using the concept map scored statistically higher on their comprehension assessments when compared to students which read the text provided without constructing a concept map. Concept maps are especially important because summarizing not only requires a reader to construct a representation of the author's message, as it is required for comprehension, but also requires a secondary decision about the relative information and importance of elements within a story. As you can see from some of our examples, we included the interests and needs of our students. We suggest you consider doing the same with your students because according to Littlefield, deliberate classroom interventions which include student diversity and interests through providing meaningful choices along with explicit instruction in summarizing can create a classroom of engaged learners with improved reading comprehension levels. As confident, successful readers ourselves, we use these strategies naturally, comfortably, and instinctively. They help us understand better. They make what we read come alive. They take us deeper into the text, which is almost every educator's goal in reading.
As we said earlier, I will now be introducing and demonstrating the plot relationship chart. This strategy will assist you in helping your students to summarize. I like to introduce my students who are in 5th grade to this graphic organizer by using a very simple and familiar story, The Three Billy Goats Gruff. I begin by reading the story to my students. If you are not familiar with this story, or if you want to refresh your memory, feel free to stop this recording now and return to our PowerPoint presentation. There will be a link where you can access the book, and Ashley will be reading it aloud for you. Now that you have listened to the book, we can begin with the plot relationship chart. As you can see in the graphic organizer displayed on the screen now and available in a reproducible form on the PowerPoint, there are 4 columns above the bottom box, which is labeled Summary. During the first few weeks of school, I cover plot. So this is one of the first graphic organizers I introduce to my students. To get them acquainted with this strategy, I place the organizer on my smartboard and they have their own copy where they follow along. If you don't have a smartboard, you can use a projector, document camera, or a prepared chart paper with the plot relationship chart drawn on it. I would also recommend laminating this paper so you can reuse it. I will begin my demonstration with the Somebody column. For this column, I always have my students identify the main character of the story and write the name of that character in the column. I have a very artistic group of students this year, so I made the semantic map more user-friendly by drawing a picture of the character under his name, Big Gruff, and they do the same. For the Wanted column, I asked the students what Big Gruff wanted and write the responses within that column. As you can see from the picture that's on the screen now, I wrote to cross the bridge to get to the green grass. I also drew a picture for this column, and I allowed my students to do the same. In the column named But, I stressed that this is where the problem or conflict happens. I asked the students, what problem did Big Gruff have in the story? I then write their responses for that column in below. The troll wouldn't let him cross. Again, I tailor the semantic map to meet the needs of my students by allowing them time to illustrate. For the So column, I stress that this section is the resolution. I ask the students for resolutions to Big Gruff's problem. If they can't recall this information, I flip back through the pictures of the book to help them. They then fill in the column as I do on the board. Big Gruff knocked him in the water. Again, I allow them time to illustrate. After all 4 columns, I read the map to the students and point to each column as we go along. It will sound something like this. Big Gruff wanted, and I point to the column heading before sliding my hand down to the actual column to cross the bridge to get to the green grass. But, again, pointing to the heading before sliding my hand down to the entry in the column. The troll wouldn't let him cross. So, and one more time, I point to the heading before sliding my hand down to our entry. Big Gruff knocked him in the water. Of course, the end goal of this semantic map is to lead to a summary. So I stop at this point and I ask the student some important questions. I ask them, do they think that this sums up our story? And they will say yes. I will then ask if they had to tell every detail to give us a summary of the story. And they will say no. Then this leads to a great discussion about what they need to include in their summaries: the main character, the problem or conflict, and the resolution. After this discussion, I demonstrate using the previously completed columns from the above organizer. And then I use a think aloud technique when creating the summary. In the summary, I begin to write, in the book, the 3 billy goats Gruff. Big Gruff wanted. I stop at this point and I point to the wanted column, and everyone finishes the sentence aloud. I also like to give an added visual by changing the font color or highlighting the font wanted, but, and so. This stresses that we are using the information that we input in the table above. I continue with the summary. Wanted to get across the bridge. He wanted to eat the green grass, but the troll wouldn't let him cross. Again, but would be in a different color font or in a highlighted font. On the picture shown on the screen now, it's red. So, Big Gruff knocked him in the water. Big Gruff crossed the bridge and ate the grass. Some students have argued with me that the Big Gruff is not the main character. I then encourage them to try it on their own with a different goat. So I give them a new organizer, and at this time, I would like you to pause the recording and do the same. Practice the use of the strategy with a different character within our story. When you're ready to move on, Ashley will be continuing with another strategy that will assist in the creation of summaries. We will both be using the 3 Billy Gruff book, so you don't need to go back to the PowerPoint presentation to listen to a new story. Enjoy!
Before you start your own examples, I would like to showcase 2 other student examples. On the yellow paper is another example of a plot relationship chart for the 3 Billy Goats graph. For the somebody section, the student wrote the Big Billy Goat graph. In the wanted section, the student wrote to cross the bridge to eat the green grass. In the but column, the student wrote the troll was blocking the way. And in the so section, they wrote he headbutted him in the stomach. At the bottom of the page, the student then took all of the components and wrote a summary, just as I have demonstrated previously. In the second example I want to show, my students completed their own plot relationship chart. I used wordless books for this activity. For this student, they wrote about 4 different people within their wordless book. The first one she wrote about was a character she named Mark. Mark wanted to fly a kite, but he didn't like the kite so he asked to borrow Emma's kite. The second line she wrote was Emma, another character she had named. Emma wanted to fly the butterfly kite, but she let Mark use it. So Emma let Mark use the kite. The third example she wrote says, Olivia wanted to use the sun kite, but she was fine without it. So she was going to ask Zach if he can use it. And the last example that she wrote says Zach wanted to use the pink kite with green stripes, but he let Mark use it instead, so he just waited. Using the plot relationship chart for wordless books ensures that the students identified the basic parts of a story's plot: the characters, the problem and conflict, and the resolution. As you can see in the bottom of this example, the summary box is empty. It is empty because I use this activity to start the narrative writing unit we do in 5th grade. I will talk about this further in the additional question section.
As Miss Martin has stated, I will continue with the three billy goats gruff. So if you are not familiar with the story, you can go back to the PowerPoint presentation and listen to it. I will begin with explaining what a circle story is and then how I use it in my kindergarten classroom. A circle story is a graphic organizer that is used by educators to assist with the organization of events that are important in a story. This is done prior to asking students to summarize the text that they are reading. Circle stories are most beneficial when used in the elementary grades, kindergarten through 5th. Prior to creating a handout, the educator needs to identify how many important events they want their students to identify. Then they can create or duplicate a handout for their students. Today, I will be demonstrating how I use this particular graphic organizer in my kindergarten classroom. Prior to introducing this to my students, I decided how many events I wanted my students to identify. I identified 7 main points that I want my students to be able to identify. This is a lot of important events. However, we will be completing the task together. The first thing that I have my students do is listen to the story. The story will either be read by using the book by myself, or it will be showcased by using the link on the PowerPoint presentation that Miss Martin pointed out earlier. I do this with my students as a whole group. The next thing I do is break my class up into their pre-assigned smaller groups, which were created based on their abilities. Once the students are in their groups, I begin by having an open discussion with my students about what happened in the story. After our discussion, I asked my students what happened first in the story. They then replied that the goats were in the mountains and that they were eating. So I then explained to my students that in this graphic organizer, we were going to draw pictures to represent the retelling of the story. I pointed out the first section or slice as we discussed what would be a good picture to represent the goats eating in the mountains. Then they drew a picture of the mountains with snow on the top, and then the 3 billy goats in the picture as well. After the students finished their picture, which I gave a brief amount of time for, maybe around 2 minutes, we next discussed what happened after the billy goats were in the mountain. I asked questions about why they wanted to leave the mountain and where did they want to go. The students responded that they wanted green grass. As you can see in this picture, the student colored it green to represent the green field of grass in which the billy goats wanted to go to. On the third section of our story circle, or circle story, that is when the goats have a conflict. They want to get to the grass. However, there is a troll that lives under the bridge that they need to cross. I then instructed my students they needed to draw a bridge and reminded them to make sure that they drew the troll. In the fourth section, we discussed what happened when the youngest billy goat tried to cross the bridge, as well as the medium billy goat. So, to showcase what happened, the student drew a bigger picture of the scary troll who lived under the bridge. We also talked about how the smallest and medium goat tricked the troll into letting them pass by telling him that the next goat was bigger and had more meat. It would be better to eat that goat. In the fifth picture, you will see that the student drew 2 goats crossing the bridge to get to the greener pasture. This ties into the last section about how the goats had tricked the troll into letting them pass. In the sixth picture, we discussed what happened in depth before I had the students draw their picture. We discussed that the big billy goat Gruff came and wanted to cross, but He decided to headbutt the troll, and the troll fell into the water. We also discussed the importance of making sure we added blue to represent the water. I had asked them, since this is kindergarten, what color a river is or what color the water is. And I would give examples like, is the water purple? Why would I not color it purple? And we talked about, realistic. And the reason we discussed this in depth is because I wanted to make sure that they remembered that key part when it was time to retell the story by using their pictures that they drew. I know in kindergarten they sometimes have a habit of using different colors to draw different things, and they really like color, but I really stressed during this activity that I wanted them to use realistic colors and make sure that they matched it. So like goats, they're not blue, or they're not green, they're not, we talked about what color they were in the story, as well as maybe what they might see in real life. Like, we don't see pink goats, so that's why we stuck with the browns. In the seventh and final section, the students wanted to draw a picture of the troll floating down the river. In this particular story, we could have added another section. However, I had the students use that first spot to write their name. If I would have had them write their name on the back and that spot was available, we would have discussed what we could draw next, and I would have had them draw a picture that depicts what happens at the end of the story. Where do the goats finally go? Do they end up going back to the mountain and up into the mountains and eating thistles? Or are they on the bridge? Did they go underneath the bridge to where the troll lived? Or did they go to the green grass and eat? And they would have drawn the 3 goats in the green grass eating. This is another picture of an example from one of my students who is also in the same group as my first student. And since we completed this in a small group, being led by me, the teacher, the pictures do look similar because we discussed what pictures we need to draw that relate to what the story, what important event is happening in that story. So with circle stories, it's really important that you do the I do, we do, you do, especially in the younger grades, in the primary grades like kindergarten. You really want to work with them and walk them through all the different steps that they need to do. And I would recommend, if you're going to do this with primary and let them do it by themselves, I would not have as many sections available. I wouldn't do 8 slices. I would do maybe 2 or 3 just for them to get in the hang of things. If I would do 3 slices, the first part I would say, okay, what happens in the beginning of the story, what happens in the middle, and what happens at the end. And then you can slowly have them make it into bigger slices. For my last student example, it is on yellow paper, so it may be a little harder to see, so I am going to read to you what was written. In this particular example, I only used 6 sections rather than the 7 or 8, and I wrote a sentence or 2 instead of using illustration. I did this so that way you could see an example of how you can differentiate depending on your students' abilities. In section 1, I wrote the 3 billy goats wanted fresh grass. That is why they wanted to leave the mountain. They wanted to go eat fresh grass. In section 2, I wrote, the baby billy goat went across the bridge and did not get eaten by the troll. Now, in this section, I could have added another sentence saying that about the goats tricking the troll.
In this third section, I wrote, next, the middle billy goat went over the bridge. He told the troll his brother was bigger. Now here I did write about how he tricked the troll into letting him cross. In the fourth section, I wrote the following. Then the big gruff crossed the bridge and pushed the troll into the water. In section 5, I wrote the troll fell into the water. And in the last section, I wrote the goats ate the grass. So this is just, another example of how to use the circle story as a way to help your students summarize the story. And then if you wanted to take it a step farther, and with this particular example, you could have your students actually, write a paper and put it into paragraph form, and everything is in order. They'll be able to order their events of what happened. So now that you know more about circle stories, I want to give you the opportunity to create your own. If you will return back to the PowerPoint presentation, there is a screen, a slide that has links needed for the presentation, and you can click on Circle Story Handout. And what this is, it has the background information of what a circle story is. So much of what you have already heard in this presentation, as well as circle story blank copy. When that link, if you click on it, there is it's blank, so you can duplicate it and use it in your own classroom. But right now, what I would like you to do is to take that blank copy, and I want you yourself to fill it out based on the 3 billy goats gruff. And this will take you about, I'll give yourself 4 or 5 minutes to do this.
So now that we have both given examples and have allowed time for you to complete your own graphic organizers, you may have some additional questions which we hope to answer in this differentiated section.
Both Ms. Martin and I will answer questions that other teachers have expressed interest in. Ms. Martin, can the plot relationships chart only be used for summarizing?
That's a great question. No, I've also used this in my classroom to help my students with the writing process. I have students begin with wordless books. They select their main character and then proceed to answer the wanted, but, and so sections. They can then continue to add additional details and minor events to the plot of their story.
You use the plot relationships chart for your 5th grade students. As a primary instructor, how can I adapt this strategy for my students?
I would recommend that when you are first starting the strategy, that you use the I do, we do, you do method. However, it will mostly be I do and we do. In the early primary stages, I would recommend illustrations rather than words, especially in kindergarten. They could then add labels, but at first use pictures. For the somebody section, I would not refer to the main character, but who the story is mostly about. And I would only do one character rather than multiples. In the wanted section, I would have the students continue with the illustrations. For the 3 billy goats gruff, they could draw a picture of the bridge, because that is what the goats wanted to cross. The but section, they could draw a picture of the troll and finish up the so section with the troll in the water. I would cross off the summary section and have them retell using their pictures.
That's how I use the circle story organizer with my kindergarten students. I use illustrations and labels. I would adapt my approach when completing the chart with intermediate grades by using more written language and omitting illustrations. During my time at clinic, I worked with a 4th grade student, and we read a chapter book, and how we conducted the story circle was by each slice represented a chapter. My client wrote 1 to 2 sentences summarizing what happened in each chapter. We also labeled each section with the chapter number and title.
How long would you suggest that students should take to complete this semantic map when using a chapter book?
I would recommend 5 to 10 minutes per section or chapter review. This could replace their morning work. It could be done during their free time, during a station, or it could be used as homework.
Looks like this is all the time we have.
If you look on the additional slides in this PowerPoint presentation, you will notice a slide which contains links to both handouts and reproducible semantic maps.
You will also find the references. Thank you for listening, and please don't forget to take our survey.